For a long time, victory still existed on Hitler's maps. Lines could be redrawn. Arrows could be shifted. And entire armies could be imagined into existence with a stroke of a pencil. Inside headquarters, the war often looked manageable. Temporary setbacks, unfortunate delays, nothing more. But maps have a dangerous quality. They obey the hand that holds them. Reality, on the other hand, does not. By the later years of the war, the reports arriving at Hitler's command posts began to change in tone. Early on, they were confident, filled with projections and assurances that the situation was under control. Now they were hesitant, carefully worded, stripped of optimism. Units weren't just retreating. They were dissolving. Divisions that should have been thousands strong existed only in name. Fuel shortages meant tanks were stationary. Aircraft grounded, and reserves that could no longer move even if they did exist. These weren't dramatic revelations, but quiet ones, and that made them harder to confront. Hitler reacted to this shift not by adjusting his worldview, but by retreating further into it. The more reality intruded, the more he clung to belief. He began to distrust the very people bringing him information, convinced that defeatism, not material collapse, was the real enemy. Generals who spoke honestly were dismissed as lacking faith. Officers who promised obedience and optimism rose in influence, regardless of whether their assurances were grounded in facts. Truth became negotiable, and illusion filled the gaps. Yet even illusion has limits. Meetings grew tense. Long silences replaced confident briefings. Questions went unanswered or were deflected with vague references to future reinforcements. Hitler still issued orders, but they increasingly described movements that could not be executed. Counterattacks by units that had already been destroyed. Defenses anchored on cities that were no longer held. Each unfulfilled order created a small crack in the narrative of control. A subtle admission that his authority no longer extended beyond the walls of the room. What made this period especially revealing was how much effort went into maintaining the appearance of inevitability. Hitler spoke often of endurance, of holding out just a little longer. He framed collapse as a test of will rather than a failure of logistics or strategy. The implication was clear. If Germany lost, it would be because someone lacked faith, not because the war had been irreversibly lost. This reframing allowed him to preserve the image of near victory even as the foundations crumbled. But signs of the truth kept leaking through. Allied bombing raids reached deeper into Germany, no longer distant threats but daily realities. Cities burned. Transportation networks shattered. And civilians felt the war in ways propaganda could no longer fully disguise. Each air raid undermined the narrative that the enemy was weakening. Each advance on the ground made it harder to argue that time was still an ally. Inside Hitler's inner circle, the shift was unmistakable. Conversations became narrower, more repetitive. The same themes returned again and again. Betrayal, destiny, miraculous reversals. He spoke less about concrete plans and more about inevitability. How history would vindicate him, how the enemy would fracture, how something unseen would intervene. These weren't the words of a leader adapting to crisis. They were the words of someone trying to hold reality at bay. And yet, beneath all of this, the cracks widened. Hitler's physical isolation mirrored his mental one. He withdrew from public appearances, limiting his exposure to anything that might challenge the carefully maintained version of events. The fewer people he saw, the easier it became to control the narrative. But isolation also meant fewer opportunities to reinforce belief through shared momentum. Doubt, once introduced, had space to grow. There were moments, brief, unguarded, when reality pressed close. A report that couldn't be explained away. A silence that stretched too long. A glance exchanged between officers that said more than words ever could. These moments didn't lead to acceptance, but they left marks. The illusion of victory didn't shatter all at once. It thinned, becoming fragile, translucent, something that required constant effort to maintain. This was the beginning of the end, not in military terms, but psychological ones. The war was no longer being lost only on the battlefield. It was being lost in the gap between what was happening and what Hitler could still convince himself to believe. Victory had not vanished. It had become abstract, hypothetical, dependent on conditions that no longer existed. And once a leader's belief in reality starts to fracture, every decision that follows carries the weight of that denial, pushing events closer to an outcome that no amount of faith can prevent. As Germany's situation continued to unravel, Hitler's thinking narrowed rather than adapted. Strategy gave way to expectation. And expectation slowly transformed into something closer to waiting. He was no longer trying to win the war in any conventional sense. Instead, he was holding out for a moment that would change everything. A miracle that would reset the balance just enough to restore control. And the dangerous part was that this hope didn't feel irrational to him. It felt earned. For years, improbable reversals had reinforced his belief that fate was on his side. Early victories, political miscalculations by his enemies, and sheer luck had taught him a powerful lesson. That endurance alone could bend reality. If Germany just survived long enough, something external would intervene. This idea became the core of his thinking as defeat closed in. He spoke less about clear objectives and more about waiting, delaying, enduring. Time, he believed, would still produce salvation. One of the miracles he waited for came in the form of wonder weapons. Secret projects, advanced rockets, jet aircraft, and revolutionary submarines were treated not as supplements to strategy, but as replacements for it. On paper, these weapons promised to terrify the enemy and force negotiation. In reality, they arrived too late. In too small numbers, and without the infrastructure to change the war's trajectory. But to Hitler, their very existence proved that the future could still be seized, even if the present was collapsing. Another miracle was political. He expected the enemy alliance to fracture under pressure. The idea that the Allies would eventually turn on each other was more than speculation. It was an assumption. He believed that ideological differences, war exhaustion, or leadership changes would cause unity to crack, creating space for Germany to survive. Every disagreement between Allied leaders was magnified in his mind into a sign of imminent collapse. Each delay on their side was interpreted as weakness, not preparation. This way of thinking allowed him to reinterpret defeat as anticipation. Losses were no longer final. They were temporary conditions endured while waiting for history to intervene. Orders reflected this mindset. Cities were commanded to hold at all costs. Not because holding them made strategic sense, but because time itself had become the objective. Every day gained was treated as a victory, even as the cost of holding grew catastrophic. But waiting has consequences. Resources dwindled while nothing replaced them. Trained soldiers were lost faster than they could be replaced. Civilian morale eroded under constant bombardment and shortages. Infrastructure collapsed, making movement and coordination nearly impossible. None of this could be fixed by patience alone. Yet patience was all that remained. Hitler's faith in delay became a substitute for action. And action without belief had already vanished. Inside his headquarters, discussions became circular. The same hopes were repeated, the same expectations recycled. Any suggestion that no miracle was coming was dismissed as defeatism. The future, in his mind, was still flexible, still capable of bending. The present, however, was something to be endured, not confronted. This inversion of priorities was fatal. Wars are decided in the present, not in imagined tomorrows. The psychological toll of this waiting was immense. Tension without resolution erodes judgment. Every setback required a new explanation, a new promise of reversal. The longer nothing happened, the more extreme the expectations became. A single breakthrough weapon. A sudden political death. A dramatic split among enemies. The miracle grew larger as the situation worsened, making its eventual absence even more devastating. And slowly, unmistakably, it became clear that time was no longer neutral. It was an enemy. Each passing week strengthened Germany's opponents and weakened Germany itself. The miracle Hitler waited for didn't fail because it was stopped. It failed because it was never real. It existed only as an idea, sustained by belief and repetition, not by material conditions. This period marked a turning point not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No sudden rescue. No unexpected reversal. Just the steady advance of reality. The waiting continued, but its meaning changed. It was no longer anticipation. It was delay without purpose. And as the war moved toward its final act, the realization began to take shape, whether consciously acknowledged or not. Miracles require circumstances to act upon. Germany no longer had those circumstances. What remained was hope stripped of power. Belief disconnected from reality, and a leadership waiting for an event that would never arrive. There is a moment in every collapse when belief finally loses its grip. Not because someone admits defeat, but because there is nothing left for belief to act upon. For Hitler, that moment did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a single catastrophic event. It arrived quietly, through accumulation. Orders went unanswered not out of disobedience, but because there was no one left to carry them out. Maps still covered the tables, but the symbols on them had become ghosts. Units that existed only in memory, defenses that could no longer be defended. The realization, when it came, was not sudden clarity. It was exhaustion. By this point, Hitler's world had shrunk to a handful of rooms and a shrinking circle of people. The distance between command and consequence had vanished. Every report pointed in the same direction. The enemy was no longer being delayed. They were advancing steadily, predictably, and without hesitation. There were no reserves left to unleash, no maneuver left to surprise. The language of possibility disappeared from briefings, replaced by inevitability. What made this phase different from earlier moments of denial was the silence. The arguments stopped. The reassurances faded. There was nothing left to reinterpret. When Hitler issued commands, they were often met with quiet acknowledgement rather than enthusiasm. As if everyone in the room understood that words no longer had the power to shape events. Authority remained in title, but control had slipped away. This is where reality finally asserted itself. Not as an enemy to be fought, but as a condition to be endured. Hitler still spoke of loyalty and duty, but the tone had changed. It was no longer about victory or even reversal. It was about endurance for its own sake. About holding on because letting go would mean accepting what had already happened. The miracle was no longer expected with confidence. It lingered only as habit, a thought repeated because silence would have been worse. Isolation deepened this realization. Cut off from the broader world, he could no longer escape into abstractions. The sounds of war were closer now. The consequences of earlier decisions were no longer theoretical. They had arrived, and they were irreversible. Power without options is a unique kind of confinement, and that was the space he now occupied. What remained was bitterness. Not toward the enemy alone, but toward the idea that things should have unfolded differently. Betrayal became a central explanation. Not because it was accurate, but because it was emotionally necessary. Accepting that the war had been lost through miscalculation and overreach would have required a reckoning he could not face. Blame was easier than reflection. And yet, beneath that bitterness, there was an unspoken understanding. No speech could summon divisions that no longer existed. No belief could restore time that had already passed. The future he had imagined was gone, replaced by a narrowing present that offered no escape. History, once seen as a force he commanded, had moved beyond him. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of the collapse. The realization didn't free him. It trapped him. Knowing that no miracle would come did not lead to acceptance or change. It led to stagnation. Decisions became smaller, more defensive, focused less on outcome and more on postponement. The end was no longer preventable, only delayable. For Germany, this moment was devastating. A nation still fighting, still suffering, but no longer being led toward any achievable goal. The gap between sacrifice and purpose became impossible to justify. What had once been framed as destiny now felt like drift. In the final stage, reality didn't need to announce itself. It simply remained unmoved by belief. The war ended not when Hitler accepted defeat, but when defeat no longer required his acknowledgement. Events unfolded without his consent. Armies advanced. Cities fell. The outcome arrived on its own terms. This is where the story closes. Not with drama, but with inevitability. A man who once believed history bent to his will came to understand. Too late, that history does not wait. When miracles are gone and belief is empty, what remains is the quiet weight of consequences. Settling into place exactly as they were always going to.